The Krethian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 300 years, and nobody dared to challenge their power because they were simply too strong and too ruthless in their methods of conquest. Commander Velrith stood on the bridge of his scout ship and looked at the strange object floating in space ahead of them. It was a simple metal buoy that seemed old and primitive by Krethian standards, but it was broadcasting a message in hundreds of languages, including perfect Krethian, which surprised him a little bit. The message was clear and direct in its warning to any ship that approached this particular region of space. It said that human-controlled territory began at this point, and any military vessel crossing this boundary would be treated as hostile and dealt with accordingly. Velrith read the message 3 times and then began to laugh because he had heard of humans before, and they were nothing special in the grand scheme of galactic civilizations. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel about 200 years ago, and they controlled maybe 12 star systems at most, according to the intelligence reports he had read before this mission. The tactical officer ran a deep scan of the area beyond the buoy and reported that there were no weapons platforms or defensive stations or military ships anywhere within range of their sensors. The border was completely undefended, which made the warning seem even more ridiculous to Velrith and his crew. He sent a message back to the Krethian High Command, explaining what they had found and recommending that the Empire move forward with annexation of this territory because the humans clearly had resources worth taking and absolutely no ability to stop them from taking it. Within 1 week, the Krethian Third Fleet assembled at the human border with 200 warships, ready to demonstrate the full might of the Empire. Admiral Corvin commanded the fleet from his massive flagship, and he looked at the lonely warning buoy with contempt, because in his 3 decades of military service he had never seen such an empty threat. He gave the order for all ships to cross the boundary and set course for a human colony world called New Montana, which intelligence said had 2 million inhabitants and valuable mining operations. The fleet moved forward as one unified force and passed the warning buoy without any resistance or response from the humans. What Corvin did not know was that the buoy was doing more than just broadcasting warnings to passing ships. It was also collecting detailed information about every vessel that crossed the line and transmitting that data to a monitoring station several light years away, where a human analyst named Greg Murphy was drinking coffee and watching his screens. Greg saw the Krethian fleet composition appear on his display, showing 200 capital ships moving in standard attack formation toward New Montana. He finished his coffee and pressed a single button on his console before speaking calmly into his communication headset. He told the person on the other end that the Krethians had crossed the border with 200 ships heading for New Montana in what appeared to be pattern Delta 7 formation. Admiral Karen Morse of the Terran Defense Fleet received the message in her command center and smiled in a way that would have frightened anyone who saw it. She confirmed the information with Greg and then gave a simple order to execute Protocol Mousetrap, which had been prepared months ago for exactly this situation. The Krethian fleet continued toward New Montana, completely unaware that they were walking into the most carefully planned trap in human military history. Admiral Corvin felt confident and relaxed in his command chair because this campaign would be over within days, and he would add another victory to his already impressive record. His crew was experienced and professional, and they had conquered many worlds together over the years, so there was no reason to think this time would be any different. The human warning had been empty words meant to scare away lesser species, but the Krethians were not lesser, and they did not scare easily. Within 36 hours, the fleet would arrive at New Montana and begin the standard procedure of orbital bombardment, followed by ground invasion if necessary. Corvin expected the humans to either flee or surrender quickly once they saw the overwhelming force arrayed against them. He had studied human psychology from the intelligence reports, and they seemed to value individual life much more than collective glory, which made them weak in his opinion. Species that feared death too much never won wars against those who embraced it as part of their duty. The Krethian Empire had built itself on the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory, and that philosophy had served them well for 3 centuries. Corvin reviewed the tactical plans one more time with his senior officers, and everyone agreed that the humans would not put up significant resistance. The orbital stations around New Montana would be destroyed first, and then the population centers would be given one chance to surrender before bombardment began. It was all very routine and predictable because the Krethians had done this exact same operation dozens of times against dozens of different species. None of those species existed as independent civilizations anymore. The Krethian Third Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the New Montana system and immediately began scanning for targets and threats, as they always did when entering a new system. Admiral Corvin watched his tactical displays light up with information about the planet and its orbital infrastructure, which all seemed completely normal for a human colony of this size. New Montana hung in space like a blue and green jewel, with white clouds swirling across its surface and several orbital stations positioned around it at various altitudes. The strange thing was that nobody was responding to their presence, and there were no defensive measures being activated anywhere in the system. Corvin frowned and ordered his communications officer to send a standard demand for surrender to the planet and all orbital facilities. The message went out, but no response came back, which was unusual, because even species that planned to fight usually sent some kind of defiant reply before the shooting started. The sensor officer reported something that made Corvin lean forward in his chair with growing concern, because according to the scans, there were no life signs anywhere in the system. The orbital stations had power, and their systems were running normally, but there were no crew members aboard any of them. The planet's surface showed active cities with lights and power grids functioning, but 0 biological signatures that matched human life forms. It was as if 2 million people had simply vanished into thin air without leaving any trace behind them. Corvin ordered 3 destroyers to break formation and investigate the nearest orbital station up close, while the rest of the fleet maintained bombardment positions around the planet. The destroyers approached slowly and carefully in case this was some kind of trap involving hidden weapons or stealth technology. They docked with the station and sent boarding teams inside who reported back within minutes that everything looked completely normal except for the total absence of people. Food was still sitting on tables in the cafeteria, and computers were still running their programs, and personal items were scattered around living quarters as if the inhabitants had just stepped out for a moment. One of the boarding team leaders described finding a cup of coffee that was still slightly warm, sitting on a desk next to a datapad, displaying a half-written message. The tactical situation made no sense to Corvin, because in all his years of military service he had never encountered anything like this before. Populations either stayed and fought, or they evacuated in ships that could be tracked and intercepted. They did not simply disappear from an entire planet and leave everything behind, including their morning coffee. He was about to order a full planetary scan when every screen on every ship in his fleet suddenly changed to show the same image at the same time. A human male appeared on the screens wearing a simple military uniform with insignia that identified him as a captain in the Terran Defense Fleet. He had dark hair and calm brown eyes, and he spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried complete confidence in every word. He introduced himself as Captain Ryan Fletcher of the TDF Vengeance, and explained that the colonists of New Montana were perfectly safe because they had been evacuated 3 days ago when human intelligence detected the Krethian fleet assembling at the border. Fletcher said that Corvin and his fleet were not attacking an undefended colony, but had instead walked directly into a carefully prepared kill zone that had been set up specifically for them. Corvin felt his blood turn cold as Fletcher continued speaking and explaining that humans had studied Krethian tactics and strategies for years and had prepared appropriate responses for every possible scenario. The sensor officer suddenly shouted a warning and pointed at his tactical display, where dozens of new contacts had just appeared surrounding the entire Krethian fleet. The objects had been there the whole time, running in complete silence and invisible to Krethian sensors until they activated their identification beacons. Fletcher explained calmly that those objects were antimatter mines, and each one contained enough explosive power to completely vaporize a ship the size of a Krethian battleship. There were 300 mines positioned at optimal strike points throughout the Krethian formation, and they had been waiting in position for 2 full days. Corvin stared at the tactical display and realized with horror that his entire fleet was trapped inside a sphere of devastating weapons that could be detonated at any moment. Fletcher gave him 2 simple choices and 60 seconds to decide between them. Option 1 was to attempt to fight, in which case Fletcher would detonate all the mines, and the Third Fleet would cease to exist within moments. Option 2 was to power down all weapons and allow human Marines to board every ship and accept peaceful surrender. The bridge crew erupted into shouting and panic as officers tried to find a way out of the trap, but the tactical computer kept showing the same result over and over. Any attempt to move or fight would result in total destruction of the fleet, with estimated casualty rates above 98%. Corvin looked at the human captain on his screen and saw no mercy in those calm brown eyes, but he also saw no cruelty or hatred. Fletcher was simply a professional doing his job and offering terms that were far more generous than the Krethians would have offered to a defeated enemy. Admiral Corvin watched the countdown timer on his screen tick down to 30 seconds and felt the weight of 300 years of Krethian military tradition pressing down on him like a physical force. Everything in his training and experience told him that surrender was dishonorable and unacceptable, but everything in his tactical analysis told him that fighting would be suicide for his entire crew. He had led these warriors through dozens of campaigns and brought them home victorious every single time, but now he faced a choice between pride and survival. Captain Fletcher waited on the screen with that same calm expression, showing no emotion at all, as the seconds continued to count down toward 0. Corvin looked around his bridge at the faces of his officers and saw fear there for the first time in all their years together, because they understood the trap as well as he did. The Krethians had walked into human space expecting easy conquest, and instead found themselves completely outmaneuvered by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive and weak. At 15 seconds remaining, Corvin made his decision and gave the order that no Krethian admiral had given in over a century. He commanded all ships in the fleet to power down their weapon systems and prepare to be boarded by human forces. The relief on the bridge was immediate and obvious as officers rushed to comply with the surrender order. Within minutes, human boarding craft were launching from ships that had been hiding behind the moons and approaching the Krethian vessels in organized formation. The Marines that came aboard were professional and efficient in their movements as they secured each ship one by one. Lieutenant Julie Banks led the boarding team that came to Corvin's flagship, and she accepted his formal surrender on the bridge in front of his assembled officers. She told him that his crew would be treated according to the laws of war, and that nobody would be harmed as long as they cooperated fully with all instructions. Corvin studied this human female, trying to understand how such a young-looking officer could command such confidence and authority. She explained that they would provide food and medical care and reasonable accommodations for all prisoners, and that the Krethians would be allowed to communicate with their families back home. Corvin asked her a question that had been bothering him since the moment Fletcher appeared on his screens. He wanted to know why the humans were showing mercy to an enemy fleet that had come to conquer their world and kill their people. Julie looked at him with an expression he could not quite read and said something that shook his understanding of warfare. She told him that showing mercy was what civilized people did and that humans defended themselves with overwhelming force when necessary, but did not become monsters in the process. Over the following days, as the captured Krethian fleet was escorted to a holding facility, Corvin had time to observe his captors and learn about their methods. The humans treated their prisoners with respect and even kindness, which confused many of the Krethian warriors who expected torture or execution. They were given comfortable quarters and good food and access to entertainment and medical care that was better than what they received in their own fleet. Corvin spent hours studying the human ships that guarded them and realized that the antimatter mines had been only the beginning of their technological advantage. The human vessels had weapon systems that made Krethian technology look ancient and outdated by comparison. Their railguns could punch through shields like they were not even there, and their energy weapons operated on principles that Krethian science did not understand at all. The defensive systems were equally impressive and could apparently render most Krethian weapons completely ineffective before they even reached their targets. During one of his meetings with Captain Fletcher, Corvin asked how long the humans had been preparing for this kind of confrontation. Fletcher smiled and explained that humanity had been preparing since the very first day they met an alien species in space because they hoped to find friends among the stars, but prepared for the possibility of finding enemies instead. He said that the Krethian Empire was not the first aggressive species in the galaxy and would certainly not be the last, so humans had decided long ago never to be caught unprepared again. Fletcher told him about Earth's history and the 20th century, which humans called the century of total war, when they spent 100 years perfecting the art of killing each other with increasingly efficient methods. They had developed nuclear weapons while still using primitive aircraft and fought wars that killed millions of their own people. Humans were very good at war, Fletcher said, but they preferred not to engage in it unless absolutely necessary. The statement made Corvin realize something disturbing about his captors. They had not won through superior aggression or willingness to die for glory, but through superior intelligence and careful preparation. The humans had studied the Krethian Empire for years and prepared specific counters for every tactic and strategy in the Krethian military doctrine. They had let the Krethians believe they were weak and undefended, while setting traps that were mathematically perfect in their execution. It was the kind of warfare that required patience and discipline and long-term planning instead of the immediate gratification of conquest. Corvin understood now why the warning buoy had been so confident in its message, because the humans genuinely did not need to bluff about their capabilities. The news of the Third Fleet's capture spread through Krethian space like a virus, infecting every level of government and military command with disbelief and rage. The High Council convened in their grand chamber on the homeworld, and the air filled with angry chittering as counselors demanded explanations for how 200 warships could be defeated without firing a single shot. Supreme Counselor Murthan stood at the center of the chamber and declared that Admiral Corvin must have been either incompetent or a coward to have surrendered so easily. The military advisors who had reviewed the tactical data knew better, and they tried to explain that the humans had executed a perfect strategic trap that gave Corvin no reasonable alternative to surrender. General Thrakus was the most respected military commander in the Empire, and he stood before the council to deliver his assessment of the situation. He said bluntly that the humans were not the primitives the Empire had believed them to be, and that they had demonstrated strategic thinking and tactical execution that equaled or exceeded anything in Krethian military history. The humans had studied Krethian methods and prepared specific counters that the Empire had never encountered before, because most species they conquered did not have time to prepare such elaborate defenses. Murthan rejected this analysis and insisted that the solution was simply to send more ships, because numbers would overwhelm whatever tricks the humans had prepared. He proposed assembling 10 fleets or 20 fleets, or however many it took to crush human resistance through sheer, overwhelming force. General Thrakus shook his head and warned that sending more fleets would just result in losing more fleets, because the humans clearly had technology and tactics that the Empire did not fully understand. He pointed out that the humans had weapon systems that made Krethian shields useless and defensive systems that rendered Krethian weapons ineffective. More importantly, the humans were fighting a defensive war which was always harder to win than a war of conquest because defenders knew their own territory and could prepare it properly. The council debated for hours, but eventually pride won over caution, as it usually did in Krethian decision-making. They authorized the assembly of the largest invasion force in Imperial history, with 1,500 warships divided into 7 separate fleets that would attack multiple human colonies simultaneously. The strategy was to overwhelm human defenses by striking at so many targets at once that they could not possibly respond to all of them. Back in human space, Admiral Karen Morse sat in her command center and watched intelligence reports come in about the Krethian military buildup. She told her staff that the Krethians were doing exactly what human analysts had predicted they would do, because Imperial pride would not allow them to accept defeat without a massive retaliation. Commander Paul Wright asked what the human response would be to an invasion force of 1,500 ships. Admiral Morse smiled in that cold way of hers and said they would let every single Krethian fleet cross the border and enter their carefully prepared killing grounds. She explained that for the past 50 years, humanity had been building something that no other species in the galaxy knew about, and now was the perfect time to demonstrate it. When the 7 Krethian fleets crossed into human space, they found the same situation that the Third Fleet had encountered, with colonies that appeared inhabited, but were actually evacuated and empty. The Krethians learned nothing from the previous disaster and assumed the humans were simply repeating the same trick. At the colony of New Berlin, a Krethian fleet was suddenly surrounded by human battleships that had been hiding in a dense asteroid field, with their heat signatures masked by the rocks themselves. The human ships opened fire with weapons that the Krethians had never seen before, and within minutes, half the fleet was disabled or destroyed. At New Shanghai, the humans used directed energy weapons that could disable a ship's power core without actually destroying the vessel, which meant they could capture entire fleets intact. At New Lagos, the Krethians encountered what appeared to be some kind of weaponized gravity field that crushed their ships like an invisible hand squeezing tin cans. 3 fleets converged on a colony called New Texas, expecting to overwhelm any defense with sheer numbers and firepower. What they found instead was something that would change the balance of power in the entire galaxy forever. The 3 Krethian fleets dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and their sensors immediately detected a single human vessel waiting for them in the space between their position and the planet. It was massive and dwarfed even the largest Krethian dreadnoughts by a significant margin. The ship's hull was smooth and dark, and covered in armor plating that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Admiral Grenthar commanded the combined Krethian force, and he stared at his display trying to understand why the humans would send one ship to face 3 entire fleets. The vessel's identification transponder activated and broadcast a simple message, identifying it as the TDF Resolution under the command of Captain Andrew Stone. Grenthar felt insulted by the human arrogance and immediately ordered his entire force to open fire and destroy this single ship as quickly as possible. Thousands of weapons fired simultaneously from hundreds of Krethian vessels, and the space between the fleets lit up with missiles and plasma bolts and kinetic rounds, all converging on the Resolution. Grenthar watched his display, expecting to see the human ship torn apart by the overwhelming firepower. But what happened next defied everything he understood about space combat. Point defense systems emerged from the Resolution's hull and began firing lasers at a rate that seemed physically impossible to achieve with any known technology. The defensive lasers intercepted and destroyed 90% of the incoming fire before it could reach the ship's hull. The remaining projectiles struck an energy shield that shimmered into visibility and absorbed impacts that should have shattered any vessel into pieces. Then the Resolution fired back with a weapon that nobody in the Krethian fleet had ever encountered before in all their centuries of conquest. A single beam of pure concentrated energy lanced out from the ship's bow and struck a Krethian battleship in the exact center of its hull. The battleship did not explode into debris, and it did not break apart into burning sections. It simply ceased to exist, as if someone had erased it from reality with the stroke of a pen. One moment there was a fully functional warship with a crew of 300, and the next moment there was nothing but empty space where it had been. Admiral Grenthar shouted for his science officer to explain what had just happened, but the officer could barely speak as he stared at his sensor readings. The beam had somehow converted the battleship's entire mass directly into energy in a fraction of a second. The power requirements for such a weapon were beyond anything Krethian science could produce or even theoretically calculate. The Resolution fired again, and another battleship vanished from existence in the same impossible way. Then it fired a third time and a fourth time, and each shot removed another Krethian vessel from the battlefield with absolute precision. The three Krethian fleets scrambled to respond, but nothing they did had any effect whatsoever on the human vessel. Their missiles exploded harmlessly against the shields, and their energy weapons dissipated before reaching the hull. Kinetic rounds fired at incredible velocities simply bounced off the armor plating like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. Captain Stone's voice came over the communication channels, and he spoke in the same calm, measured tone that Captain Fletcher had used at New Montana. He explained that the Krethians had come expecting conquest, but had failed to understand something fundamental about humanity. Humans did not start fights, but they always finished them when someone else started one. The Resolution continued its steady advance through space, moving with impossible grace for something so massive. Its main weapon fired with metronomic precision, and each shot erased another Krethian ship from existence. The supporting human vessels that had been hiding in the outer system now revealed themselves and began systematically disabling the remaining Krethian ships. Grenthar watched his tactical display and felt true despair for the first time in his long military career. In less than 15 minutes, his three fleets had lost over a third of their ships, and the Resolution showed absolutely no signs of damage or even stress. This was not a battle because battles required two sides capable of fighting each other. This was an execution carried out with cold, mechanical efficiency. Captain Stone gave Grenthar the same choice that had been offered to Admiral Corvin. Surrender immediately and be treated fairly according to human laws of war, or continue fighting and be destroyed piece by piece until nothing remained. Grenthar gave the order to cease fire and surrender because there was simply no point in dying for pride when the outcome was already decided beyond any doubt. Across human space, the same story repeated itself at every colony the Krethians had attacked. Every single fleet was either captured intact or destroyed completely within hours of entering human territory. 1,500 warships that represented the pride and power of the Krethian Empire were now either in human custody or floating as debris in space. The Krethian High Council received a transmission from the human government, and it was delivered by Secretary of Defense Helen Crawford, who had gray hair and eyes that showed she had witnessed far too much war in her lifetime. She explained to the assembled council that they had invaded human space and threatened human lives and completely ignored the warning that had been clearly posted at their border. The Krethians had made the fatal mistake of confusing human preference for peace with human capacity for war. The humans were currently holding 43,000 Krethian military personnel as prisoners and would return every single one of them unharmed under certain specific conditions. First, the Krethian Empire would formally recognize human territorial sovereignty and would never enter human space without explicit permission. Second, the Empire would cease all military expansion and conquest for a period of no less than 50 standard years. Third, the Empire would pay reparations to every species they had conquered and would grant full independence to any species that requested it. Helen Crawford made it absolutely clear that humans had no interest in conquering the Krethian Empire or any other civilization, but would not tolerate any further aggression toward human territory or human people. If the Krethians crossed the human border again with military intent, there would be no more captures and no more mercy. Human fleets would destroy any Krethian military presence completely, and if necessary, would bring the full weight of human military power directly to Krethian worlds. The border warning had not been an empty bluff or a hopeful deterrent. It had been a solemn promise, and the humans had now proven they had both the capability and the will to keep that promise. General Thrakis stood before the council after the transmission ended and delivered his final assessment of the situation. He told them that the humans had been holding back their full capabilities during every engagement and had won their victories while deliberately minimizing casualties on both sides. They had demonstrated overwhelming technological superiority while showing mercy and restraint, which was the mark of a truly advanced and confident civilization. The Council accepted the human terms without any debate because every member understood that refusing would mean the complete destruction of their empire. The captured fleets were returned over the following months, and the prisoners came home with stories about human treatment that fundamentally changed how Krethians thought about concepts like strength and weakness. The border remained completely quiet after that day, and the warning buoy continued its eternal broadcast. Behind that border, humanity continued to grow and build and develop technologies that amazed and sometimes frightened the other species of the galaxy. Every species that heard the story of the Krethian invasion learned an important lesson about underestimating the humans. The warning had been real, and the humans had proven it at terrible cost to those who refused to listen. The galaxy was ultimately better for it.
The Velthari convoy moved slowly through the darkness of space. 12 ships traveled together in a tight formation. Each ship carried hundreds of refugees who had fled their dying world. They had been traveling for many weeks and they were tired and scared. Their home planet had been destroyed by a massive solar flare that no one had predicted. Now 3,000 Velthari souls drifted through the void searching for a new place to live. Commander Zin Ora stood on the bridge of the lead ship called the Eternal Hope. She was tall and thin, with pale blue skin and large dark eyes. Her people were known throughout the galaxy as peaceful scholars and artists. They had never fought a war in their entire history. They had never needed weapons because they had always solved their problems with words and wisdom. But words and wisdom could not help them now. Zin Ora looked at the navigation display and felt a small sense of relief. They were only 3 more days away from the neutral zone, where they could request asylum from the Galactic Council. 3 more days and her people would finally be safe. She allowed herself a tiny smile for the first time in weeks. Then the alarms started screaming. Red lights flashed across every console on the bridge. Her crew members shouted in panic as they tried to understand what was happening. Zin Ora gripped the edge of her command console and stared at the sensor display. Her blood turned cold when she saw what was coming. 12 ships emerged from fold space all around the convoy. They appeared out of nowhere, like ghosts materializing from thin air. These ships were nothing like the elegant crystalline vessels of the Velthari. They were angular and black and covered with weapons. They looked like predators built for one purpose only. Zin Ora recognized them immediately. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy knew those ships. They were Kravik hunter vessels, and their appearance meant only one thing: death or slavery awaited anyone who crossed their path. The Kravik were the most feared pirates and slavers in known space. They had terrorized the weaker species for thousands of years. Their entire civilization was built on conquest and cruelty. They captured beings from across the galaxy and sold them to the highest bidder. No one had ever successfully stood against them because no one was strong enough to try. The hunter ships spread out in a perfect circle around the Velthari convoy. They moved with practiced precision, like wolves surrounding a flock of sheep, their weapons powered up with a low humming sound that could be detected even across the vacuum of space. The message was clear. There was no escape. A transmission came through on all frequencies. The face that appeared on the view screen made Zinora want to look away. The Kravik commander was a massive reptilian creature with green scales and yellow eyes. A long scar ran down the left side of his face from forehead to jaw. His mouth was full of sharp teeth that he displayed in what might have been a smile. "Velthari vessels," the creature said in a harsh, gravelly voice. "I am Commander Torvek, of the Kravik hunting fleet. You are now my property. You will power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will result in the immediate destruction of one ship. Compliance will result in a slightly less painful transition to your new lives as slaves." Torvik paused, and his horrible smile grew wider. "You have 10 minutes to decide. I suggest you use that time wisely." The transmission ended, and the bridge fell silent. Zinora looked around at her crew. She saw fear in every face. She saw despair and hopelessness. Some of them were crying silently. Others simply stared at nothing with empty eyes. She wanted to tell them that everything would be fine. She wanted to say that help was coming. But she could not lie to her people. No help was coming. It never did. The galaxy was a cruel place, where the strong devoured the weak. The Velthari had always known this truth, but they had hoped it would never touch them directly. Zinora made a decision. She walked to the communications console and pushed the operator aside gently. Her fingers moved across the controls as she activated the emergency distress beacon. It was a desperate act and probably useless, but she had to try something. "This is Commander Zinora of the Velthari refugee convoy," she said into the microphone. "We are under attack by Kravik hunter ships in Sector 742. We have 3,000 civilians, including many children. We have no weapons and no way to defend ourselves. If anyone can hear this message, please help us. Please." She broadcast the message on every frequency available. She knew that no one would answer. The nearest friendly species was weeks away. The Galactic Council had no military force of its own, and no one in their right mind would challenge the Kravik over a convoy of refugees. The minutes ticked by slowly. Torvek did not attack immediately because he enjoyed watching his victims suffer. The psychological torture was part of the process. He wanted the Velthari to feel completely hopeless before he took them. It made the slaves easier to control later. The hunter ships began to circle the convoy in a slow, lazy pattern. They moved like sharks, swimming around wounded prey. Occasionally, one ship would fire a warning shot that passed close to a Velthari vessel. The shots were not meant to destroy. They were meant to terrify. Zinora watched the circling ships and felt tears running down her face. She thought about the children on her ships. She thought about the families who had already lost everything when their world died. Now, they would lose their freedom as well. Some of them would not survive the brutal conditions of Kravik slave camps. The old and the sick would be disposed of as worthless. The young and strong would be worked until they broke. She had failed her people. She had promised to lead them to safety, and instead she had led them into a trap. The guilt was overwhelming. The 10 minutes ended and Torvek's face appeared on the view screen again. "Time is up, Velthari Commander," he said with obvious pleasure. "What is your decision? Will you surrender peacefully? Or must I demonstrate my seriousness?" Zinora opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, something happened that no one expected. Every sensor on every ship suddenly detected a new contact. Something was coming out of fold space directly between the Kravik fleet and the Velthari convoy. Torvek's expression changed from amusement to confusion. "What is this?" he demanded. A ship appeared where nothing had been before. It was unlike anything the Kravik or Velthari had ever seen. And everything was about to change. The ship that emerged from fold space was completely unknown to everyone present. Commander Torvek stared at his sensor display and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The vessel was gray and angular with a design philosophy that matched nothing in the Kravik database. It was covered in strange geometric patterns and carried equipment that his sensors could not properly identify. The ship was small. It was perhaps 1/3 the size of a standard Kravik hunter vessel. Torvek had commanded his fleet for over 40 years, and he had encountered hundreds of different species during that time. He knew every major civilization in the galaxy, and most of the minor ones as well. But he had never seen anything like this ship before. His tactical officer ran the vessel through every identification system available. Nothing matched. The ship did not appear in any database. Its energy signature was unfamiliar. Even its hull composition was made from materials that the scanners could not recognize. It was as if this vessel had come from another galaxy entirely. Torvek felt a small flicker of unease, but he pushed it aside. Size mattered in space combat, and this newcomer was tiny compared to his fleet. Whatever species crewed that ship had made a fatal mistake by interfering with Kravik business. The unknown vessel broadcast a message on an open channel. The voice that spoke was calm and steady with an accent that no one recognized. It spoke in standardized galactic common, which meant that whoever they were, they had at least some contact with known civilizations. This is Captain John Miller of the USS Dauntless, representing the United Earth Coalition. We detected your distress signal and have arrived to render assistance. Please identify the nature of your emergency. Commander Zin Aura heard the message on her bridge and felt a tiny spark of hope ignite in her chest. Someone had actually responded to her desperate call. She did not know what Earth was or what humans were, but someone had come. After all these hours of terror, someone had actually come. Torvek's unease faded and was replaced by amusement. He had never heard of Earth or the United Earth Coalition. This was clearly some primitive species that had stumbled into affairs far beyond their understanding. The foolish captain of that tiny ship had just signed his own death warrant. Torvek activated his own communication system and responded to the human vessel. Unknown ship, this is Commander Torvek of the Kravik hunting fleet. These Velthari refugees are now Kravik property. This is Kravik territory and Kravik business. You will leave immediately or you will be destroyed alongside these worthless creatures. This is your only warning. There was a pause of several seconds. Torvik imagined the alien captain realizing his mistake and preparing to flee. That was what always happened when lesser species encountered Kravik power. They ran, or they died. There was no third option. The human captain's response came through clearly on all channels. I don't think so. Torvek blinked in surprise. He was not certain he had heard correctly. No one spoke to the Kravik that way. No one had dared to challenge them so directly in living memory. This human either did not understand the situation or he was completely insane. Repeat that, Torvek demanded. I said no, Captain Miller replied. His voice remained calm and unbothered as if he were discussing something trivial. These people called for help and we answered. We are not leaving until they are safe. If you want them, you will have to go through us first. Torvek felt his anger rising. This tiny ship, crewed by an unknown species, was defying him openly. His reputation was built on fear and dominance. If word spread that some primitive newcomers had stood up to him without consequences, his entire operation would suffer. Other victims might start thinking they could resist as well. He made his decision quickly. 4 ships break formation and destroy that vessel, he ordered. Make it slow. I want them to regret their foolishness before they die. 4 Kravik hunter ships peeled away from the circle around the Velthari convoy. They accelerated toward the human vessel with weapons charging. Each hunter ship was 3 times the size of the Dauntless and carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon. 4 of them together represented overwhelming force against a single target. Commander Zin Aura watched in horror as the hunter ships moved to engage. She had seen this happen before. Other species had occasionally tried to intervene when the Kravik attacked. The results were always the same. The would-be heroes were destroyed, and the Kravik took what they wanted anyway. They are going to die because of us, she whispered. They came to help and now they are going to die. The 4 hunter ships spread into an attack formation designed to catch the human vessel in a crossfire. They opened fire with their primary weapons, sending beams of destructive energy streaking across space toward the tiny gray ship. But the Dauntless was not where the beams were aimed. The human vessel moved with speed and agility that seemed impossible. It twisted and rolled through space in ways that should have torn any ship apart. The Kravik weapons fire passed harmlessly through empty space where the Dauntless had been just a fraction of a second before. Torvek watched with growing disbelief as the human ship evaded every shot his hunters fired. The vessel was dancing through a storm of weapons fire without taking a single hit. His tactical officer reported that the human ship was pulling maneuvers that would kill any biological crew through acceleration forces alone. Yet somehow, it kept moving and kept dodging. Then the Dauntless began to fight back. The human ship released a spread of small projectiles that the Kravik sensors dismissed as primitive kinetic weapons. The hunters did not even bother to evade such pathetic attacks. Their shields were designed to stop energy weapons and heavy missiles. Simple metal projectiles were beneath their concern. That assumption lasted approximately 3 seconds. The projectiles detonated in precise patterns around the hunter ships. They were not kinetic weapons at all. They were electromagnetic pulse devices designed to scramble electronic systems. The Kravik targeting computers went blind. Their shield generators fluctuated wildly. Their communications dissolved into static. In the chaos that followed, the Dauntless struck. The human ship closed to point-blank range and opened fire with weapons that burned through Kravik armor like it was made of paper. 2 hunter ships were disabled in under 60 seconds. Their engines exploded and their weapons went silent. They drifted helplessly with fires burning across their hulls. The remaining 2 hunter ships tried to retreat, but the Dauntless pursued them with relentless determination. Captain Miller's voice came across the open channel once more. "The next shots will not be aimed at your engines. Withdraw now." The surviving hunters fled back toward the main formation as fast as their damaged systems would allow. They left trails of smoke and debris behind them. Their hulls were scarred with weapon impacts, and their crews were in panic. Torvek stared at his display in shocked silence. A single ship crewed by a species he had never heard of had just humiliated 4 of his best hunters in less than 2 minutes. This was not possible. This should not be happening. But it was happening. And it was only the beginning. Commander Torvek stood completely still on his bridge. His crew was silent around him. No one dared to speak or even breathe too loudly. They had all witnessed the same impossible thing. 4 Kravik hunter ships had been defeated by a single vessel from an unknown species. 2 of those ships were now drifting wreckage and 2 others were limping back to formation with heavy damage. This had never happened before. The Kravik had ruled these space lanes for generations. They had crushed every challenge and broken every resistance. Their reputation was built on the simple fact that no one could stand against them. Now that reputation was crumbling before their eyes. Torvek forced himself to think clearly. He was still angry, but anger would not help him now. He needed to understand what he was facing before he made his next move. He turned to his intelligence officer and demanded information. "Tell me everything about this species called humans," he ordered. "Search every database. Find any record of contact with Earth or the United Earth Coalition." The intelligence officer worked frantically at his console for several minutes. When he finally looked up, his expression was troubled. "Commander, there is almost nothing in our records. The species known as humans apparently originated on a small planet called Earth in an unremarkable solar system. They achieved interstellar travel approximately 100 years ago. They have had minimal contact with other galactic civilizations. Most surveys classified them as a primitive species, with limited technology and no significant military capability." Torvek gestured angrily at the view screen, where the Dauntless still held position between his fleet and the Velthari convoy. "Does that look like limited technology to you? Does that look like no significant military capability?" The intelligence officer had no answer. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Captain John Miller assessed the situation with calm professionalism. He was a man of average height, with short brown hair and gray eyes that had seen too much conflict. He had served in the United Earth Coalition Navy for 25 years. He had fought in 3 colonial wars and 2 border conflicts against hostile alien species. He knew battle, and he knew death, but he also knew duty. His first officer, Lieutenant Kate Williams, stood beside him studying the tactical display. She was younger than Miller, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had graduated top of her class at the academy and had chosen to serve on the Dauntless because she wanted to make a difference on the frontier. "Captain, the 2 disabled ships are no longer a threat," she reported. "But the remaining 8 hunter vessels are reforming. They appear to be preparing for a coordinated attack." Miller nodded slowly. He had expected this. Pirates like the Kravik could not afford to show weakness. If they retreated now, their reputation would be destroyed. Other victims would start fighting back. Their entire operation depended on the belief that resistance was futile. Torvik had no choice but to attack with everything he had. "What is the status of the refugee convoy?" Miller asked. "They are holding position behind us. No damage reported. They are broadcasting messages of gratitude on all frequencies." Miller allowed himself a small smile. Those refugees were why he was here. 3,000 innocent lives that would have been condemned to slavery if the Dauntless had not responded to their distress call. Some of his superiors back on Earth would question his decision to engage a superior force. They would talk about acceptable risks and strategic considerations. But Miller did not care about politics. He cared about doing what was right. "Signal the Velthari convoy," he ordered. "Tell them to prepare their faster-than-light drives for emergency jump. If things go badly, they should run and not look back." Williams relayed the message while Miller turned his attention back to the enemy fleet. 8 hunter ships against 1 Dauntless. The odds were not good. His ship had performed brilliantly in the opening engagement, but surprise would not work twice. The Kravik knew what they were dealing with now. They would adapt their tactics. Chief Engineer Ben Carter's voice came over the internal communication system from the engine room. "Captain, I have to be honest with you. Those maneuvers we pulled earlier pushed the inertial dampeners to their limit. If we try that again, we might shake ourselves apart. The crew can only take so much, even with our enhanced systems." Miller understood. Human technology had advanced rapidly in the past century, but they were not invincible. The Dauntless was tough, but it was not indestructible. 8 enemy ships firing at once would be nearly impossible to evade. "Understood, Ben. Do what you can to keep us flying." On the Kravik flagship, Torvik had made his decision. He would not divide his forces again. He would attack with every remaining ship at once. The human vessel was impressive, but it could not be everywhere at once. Concentrated firepower would overwhelm its defenses. "All ships," he broadcast to his fleet. "Attack formation Omega. Target that human vessel and destroy it completely. Leave nothing but atoms." The 8 hunter ships began to move. They formed into a tight wedge formation designed to deliver maximum firepower to a single target. Their weapons charged with a distinctive whine that could be felt through the hulls of nearby vessels. This was the formation they used when they wanted something erased from existence. Commander Zine Ora watched from her bridge with tears streaming down her face. The human ship had bought them time with its incredible display of combat skill, but now the full weight of the Kravik fleet was descending upon it. One ship could not possibly survive against such overwhelming force. "They are going to die for us," she said quietly. "Those brave humans are going to die because they chose to help strangers." She ordered her ships to prepare for emergency jump, as the human captain had instructed. But she also ordered her communications officer to record everything that happened. If the humans were going to sacrifice themselves for the Velthari, the galaxy would know about it. Their courage would be remembered even if they did not survive. The Dauntless held its position directly between the advancing Kravik fleet and the refugee convoy. Captain Miller stood at the center of his bridge with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at his crew and saw no fear in their faces. They were scared, of course. Only a fool would not be scared, but they were also determined. They were also ready. "All hands," Miller said calmly over the ship-wide communication system. "This is the captain. We are about to engage a superior enemy force in defense of innocent civilians. I will not lie to you. The odds are not in our favor. But I want you to remember something. We are human beings. Our ancestors crossed oceans in wooden boats. They survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. They never gave up. They never surrendered. And neither will we." He paused and looked at the tactical display one more time. "We hold the line. No matter what happens, we hold the line. Those refugees are counting on us. I expect every member of this crew to do their duty." Miller out. The Kravik fleet accelerated to attack speed. The Dauntless powered up its weapons and raised its shields. And the battle for survival began. The Kravik fleet opened fire simultaneously. 8 hunter ships unleashed their full weapon systems at the single human vessel standing in their path. Beams of destructive energy crossed the void in streams of deadly light. Missiles launched from multiple tubes and accelerated toward the target. The amount of firepower directed at the Dauntless would have been enough to destroy a small battle fleet. Captain Miller gave his orders with calm precision. The Dauntless did not try to evade this time. There was no point. The attack was coming from too many angles at once. Instead, the ship raised its shields to maximum power and braced for impact. The first wave of weapons fire struck the shields, and the Dauntless shook violently. Crew members grabbed onto anything they could find to stay on their feet. Consoles sparked, and alarms screamed throughout the ship. The shields held, but the strain was enormous. Shields at 70%, Lieutenant Williams reported. They are hitting us hard. Miller nodded grimly. Return fire. Target their lead ships. The Dauntless fought back with everything it had. Human weapons technology was different from anything the Kravik had encountered before. Earth had developed its military systems in isolation, without copying from other galactic powers. The result was unique and devastatingly effective. Railgun rounds accelerated to incredible speeds by magnetic fields tore through Kravik armor. Directed energy weapons burned holes in enemy hulls. Guided missiles with adaptive targeting found weak points in shield coverage and exploited them ruthlessly. 2 more Kravik hunter ships suffered critical damage in the opening exchange. One lost its main reactor and began drifting helplessly. The other took a direct hit to its weapons bay, causing a chain reaction that blew off half its hull. But 6 ships remained fully operational, and they kept firing. The Dauntless absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other vessel in known space. Human engineers had learned hard lessons over a century of conflict. They built their ships tough because they knew that humans would always be outnumbered. The hull was layered with ablative armor designed to absorb energy weapon impacts. The internal structure was reinforced with materials that could flex without breaking. Every system had backups, and every backup had backups. Even so, the damage mounted steadily. Shields failing on Deck 7, Ensign Sam Turner reported from his station. We have fires in compartments 12 through 15. Medical bay reports multiple casualties. Chief Engineer Carter's voice came from the engine room, strained with effort. Captain, we are losing power to the secondary weapons array. I am rerouting from life support on the damaged sections, but it is going to get cold for anyone still over there. Do what you have to do, Ben, Miller replied. Keep us in the fight. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was actually only minutes. The Dauntless spun and rolled and twisted through space using every ounce of maneuverability its damaged systems could provide. It was not enough to avoid all incoming fire, but it was enough to avoid the worst of it. The ship was bleeding from dozens of wounds, but it refused to die. Commander Torvek watched the battle from his flagship with growing frustration. The human vessel should have been destroyed by now. His fleet was pouring enough firepower into that tiny ship to crack a planet. Yet somehow it kept fighting. Somehow it kept shooting back. And every time it shot back, another Kravik ship suffered damage. What are these creatures? He demanded of no one in particular. Why will they not die? Another hunter ship exploded as a human missile found its engine core. That made 4 Kravik vessels destroyed, and 2 more heavily damaged. Only 4 fully operational ships remained against the single human vessel. The odds had shifted dramatically, and Torvek could feel his crew's confidence wavering. On the Dauntless, the situation was desperate. The ship was barely holding together. Fires burned in multiple sections. The shields were down to emergency reserves only. Hull breaches had forced evacuation of 3 entire decks. The casualty list was growing longer every minute. Lieutenant Williams looked at her captain with blood running down her face from a cut on her forehead. Sir, we cannot take much more of this. Shields are at 12%. Main weapons are offline. We have maybe 5 minutes before total system failure. Miller studied the tactical display with burning eyes. They had done incredible damage to the enemy fleet, but it was not enough. 4 hunter ships were still firing at them, and the Dauntless was falling apart around them. But the Velthari convoy was still safe behind them. 3,000 refugees were still alive because the Dauntless had drawn all the fire. If the ship could hold together just a little longer, maybe the convoy could escape. Signal the Velthari, Miller ordered. Tell them to jump now, while the Kravik are focused on us. Williams hesitated. Sir, if they jump, we will have no support. We will be alone. We were always alone, Lieutenant. Send the signal. Commander Zinora received the message and felt her heart break. The humans were telling her to run. They were telling her to leave them behind to die while her people escaped to safety. It was the most selfless act she had ever witnessed. Part of her wanted to refuse. Part of her wanted to stay and try to help somehow. But she knew there was nothing her unarmed ships could do except get destroyed alongside the humans. The best way to honor their sacrifice was to survive. All ships prepare for emergency jump, she ordered through her tears. Set coordinates for the neutral zone. We leave in 60 seconds. The Velthari convoy began powering up their faster-than-light drives. The Kravik detected the energy buildup and realized what was happening. Torvek screamed orders at his remaining ships to break off from the human vessel and intercept the fleeing refugees. But the Dauntless would not let them. The human ship threw itself directly into the path of the Kravik vessels. It used its damaged hull as a physical barrier blocking their pursuit. Captain Miller ordered every remaining weapon fired at maximum rate to force the enemy ships to deal with him instead of chasing the convoy. "You want those refugees?" Miller shouted across the open communication channel. "You go through me first." The Kravik ships had no choice. They could not ignore a threat directly in front of them. They turned their weapons back on the Dauntless and resumed firing. Behind the battle, the Velthari convoy vanished into faster-than-light travel, one ship at a time. Commander Zin Ora was the last to leave. She watched the Dauntless fighting alone against 4 enemy ships as her own vessel prepared to jump. The human ship was burning and broken, but it was still fighting. It was still protecting strangers who it had no obligation to help. "Thank you," she whispered, even though no one could hear her. "The galaxy will know what you did here today." Then she was gone and the Dauntless was truly alone. The Velthari convoy had escaped. 3,000 refugees were now safely in faster-than-light travel heading toward the neutral zone. Captain Miller allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before turning his attention back to the 4 Kravik hunter ships that were still trying to destroy him. The Dauntless was in terrible condition. The shields had failed completely. Half the weapons systems were offline. The hull was breached in multiple locations, and fires burned throughout the ship. Chief Engineer Carter reported that the main reactor was showing dangerous fluctuations. They had minutes of combat capability remaining at most, but they were still alive, and they were still fighting. Commander Torvek stared at the human vessel with something approaching respect. He had never seen anything like this before. The tiny ship had single-handedly destroyed or disabled 8 of his 12 hunter ships. It had protected 3,000 refugees until they escaped. It had defied everything he knew about space combat and survival. His own fleet was devastated. Only 4 ships remained operational, and even those were damaged. His reputation as an unstoppable predator was ruined. Word of this battle would spread across the galaxy. Other species would hear that a single human vessel had broken a Kravik hunting fleet. The fear that had protected his operations for decades would begin to fade. Torvek made a decision. He activated his communication system and broadcast to the human ship. "Human captain," he said slowly. "Why? I must know why. These Velthari were nothing to you. You could have left when you saw our numbers. You could have survived. Why would you sacrifice yourself for strangers? What possible reason could justify this?" Captain Miller stood on his burning bridge surrounded by injured crew members and failing systems. He was exhausted and wounded, but his voice was steady when he replied, "Because that is what humans do. We do not abandon people who need help. We do not look away when monsters prey on the innocent. And we never give up. Not ever." Torvik considered this answer. It made no logical sense to him. The Kravik had evolved in a harsh environment, where only the strong survived. Helping strangers was weakness. Sacrifice was foolishness. The universe rewarded those who took what they wanted and destroyed those who got in the way. Yet here was this human captain, bleeding and dying but completely unbroken. His ship was falling apart, but his spirit remained intact. There was something in those words that Torvek did not understand but could not ignore. "You are insane," Torvek said finally. "Your entire species must be insane." Miller actually laughed at that. It was a tired laugh, but genuine. "Maybe we are, but we are also still here. And so are those refugees you wanted to enslave. So I guess our insanity works." Torvek looked at his tactical display and made a calculation. He could probably destroy the human ship if he pressed the attack, but his own vessels would take more damage in the process. The humans had proven they would not die easily. And for what purpose? The prey had already escaped. There was nothing to gain by continuing this fight. "This is not over, human," he growled. "The Kravik have long memories. We will meet again." "I look forward to it," Miller replied without hesitation. "Next time, bring more ships." The 4 remaining Kravik hunters broke off their attack and began moving away from the battlefield. They activated their faster-than-light drives one by one and vanished into the void. Commander Torvik was the last to leave. He took one final look at the burning human vessel that had defied everything he believed about power and survival. Then he was gone. The Dauntless drifted alone among the wreckage of the battle. Lieutenant Williams slumped against her console and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. "They are gone, sir. The Kravik have retreated." Captain Miller nodded slowly. His legs felt weak, and he realized he had been running on pure adrenaline for the entire fight. Now that it was over, his body was demanding payment for the effort. "Damage report," he ordered. The numbers were grim. 37 crew members were wounded, and 12 were dead. The ship was barely functional, with most systems operating on emergency backup power. They were weeks away from any friendly port, and had no guarantee of reaching one. But they were alive. Against impossible odds, they had survived. Ensign Turner looked up from his console with an expression of disbelief. "Sir, I am receiving a transmission. It is from the Velthari convoy. They made it to the neutral zone safely. Commander Zin Ora is broadcasting a message of thanks on all frequencies. She is telling everyone what happened here. She is telling the entire galaxy about the humans who saved her people." Miller felt a warmth spread through his chest despite his exhaustion. This was why he had joined the Navy all those years ago. This was why humans had reached for the stars in the first place. Not for conquest or profit, but for moments like this. Moments when they could make a difference. Moments when they could be the light in the darkness. "Signal command," he said. "Tell them the Dauntless needs pickup. And tell them that humanity just made some new friends." In the weeks that followed, the story of the Battle of Sector 742 spread across known space. Every species heard the tale of the single human ship that had defied a Kravik hunting fleet to save 3,000 refugees. Scholars analyzed the tactical data. Military leaders studied the weapon systems. Politicians debated what this meant for the balance of power in the galaxy. But it was the ordinary beings who were most affected. The slaves in Kravik camps whispered to each other about the humans who had shown that the slavers could be beaten. The refugees fleeing conflict zones dared to hope that someone might come to help them. The weak and the oppressed looked toward the stars and wondered if the humans would come for them too. Commander Zin Ora eventually reached safe haven with her people. She dedicated the rest of her life to spreading the story of what Captain Miller and his crew had done. She traveled to dozens of worlds, telling everyone she met about the strange species called humans who would risk everything to help strangers. When asked to describe humans in a single word, she always gave the same answer: hope. The galaxy had changed forever. The Kravik still existed, but their grip on the shipping lanes was weaker now. Other species were beginning to fight back, and everyone knew that somewhere out there, a young species called humanity was watching. They were ready to help. They were ready to fight. And they would never, ever give up. Captain John Miller eventually received a new ship and a promotion he did not want. He spent the rest of his career doing exactly what he had always done: finding people who needed help and providing it, fighting bullies and protecting the innocent, being human, because that was what humans did. That was what humans had always done. And that was what humans would continue to do, until the last star burned out and the universe itself grew dark. They would be the light. They would be the hope. They would be humanity.